Darwin is challenging to read in a number of ways. He's dense, like George Eliot, but also like George Eliot is a beautiful writer, but it's slow going. So I've tried to outline for you the key ideas and quotes from the origin. Um, First thing to say, I think, is that the origin of species is about why there's no such thing as species, let alone origin. Darwin's on the same page as Eliot in terms of the web. Plants and animals, remote in the scale of nature, are bound together by a web of complex relations. Species per se do not exist. All there are variations. The fact that Darwin doesn't believe in species is related to other factors that make about Darwin's general worldview and perspective that's challenging, I think, to our normal worldview. First of all, to looking at the natural world in terms of economy of abundance rather than an economy of scarcity. This basic premise that organic life is a result of excess energy, excess value. We're so used to thinking about value in terms of scarcity. That's the same idea with species. It's just there are limited categories, whereas Darwin proceeds from the premise that nature is overflowing, with variety. That what nature is about is excess. What natural selection is about is exploiting excess, trying to exploit the all the variety of possibilities of life. Also related to that, a challenging aspect of Darwin, like thinking about climate change, is uh, thinking in terms of large scales of time, geological time scales, evolutionary processes that taking place over at time scales that we can't imagine, just like climate change. That's what makes literature and poetry, important allies of Darwinism, and especially a writer like George Eliot, thinking about the web, this interrelatedness at mass scale in time and space. So it makes it right to talk about Darwinism in terms of queerness, because it's a theory of identity and community, communication, based on the inaccessibility of norms, approaching nature as a system that rewards creative, non normative interaction. The real core of his theory is this idea of geometrical population growth, which is interesting. It's most famously associated with Thomas Malthusianism, which is the idea applied to human societies that population growth ends up leading to scarcity, that we outgrow, our reproduction outpaces our production of food, which is quite contested. He's thought to have really underestimated the power both of technology, industrial revolution, in increasing our food production, and birth control in decreasing our reproduction. But this idea of geometrical population growth is the core idea of Darwin's natural selection and theory of evolution. There's no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate that if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. That's amazing. Even slow breeding man has doubled in 25 years, and at this rate, in less than 1,000 years, there would literally not be standing room. Um, so, so natural selection is about managing this abundance, maximizing the creative sharing of resources. Each species is using its excessive fecundity to uh, find little niches to exploit in the most efficient manner the resources available. Here's Darwin's picture of uh, sort of tree branching, the evolution of species. You can already see in this minimalist drawing sort of the kernel of a fractal pattern or a leaf pattern. But this is the pattern of variation among species. These pods, these clusters branch out. When they hit a successful variation, that variation branches out. And then again, that's just a arborization. It's what treeification is what it's called. And it's a universal form in nature. This is how Darwin describes natural selection. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there's frequently recurring struggle for existence, follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. So success is correlated with diversity. The more successful, the more variation. So the more successful a certain trait, the more varieties of that trait, variations on that trait, you'll find. That's what he means by the principle of divergence. The more diversified the descendants from any one species become in structure, constitution, and habits. It's important to remember he's talking about behavior too, not just the form, morphology of the organism, but the behavior. By so much will they be better enabled to seize on many and widely diversified places in the polity of nature. It's an interesting metaphor, the diversity of nature as a city or polity. What applies to one animal applies throughout all time to all animals, so be it with plants. It's been experimentally proved that if a plot of ground be sown with one species of grass and a similar plot be sown with several distinct genera of grasses, a greater number of plants and a greater weight of dry herbage can be raised in the latter than in the former case. Diversity breeds diversity. Again, it's like the emergence of organic life from inorganic in the first place is this burgeoning complexity, more complex arrangements of energy. And so success in nature, success in reproduction, or propagating the species is tantamount, is the same thing as diversifying the species. And so we get this kind of recurrent pattern, more diversification that then gives rise to new species, which then proceeds to diversify itself. Okay, I think he pursues an infinite division of intellectual labor, trying to find always a finer and finer grained representation of the natural world. That's what you see in these patterns, is the way in which mathematically the precision, actually the two-dimensional precision at a certain point breaks out into a third dimension and starts twisting back on itself. And this, these are organic natural patterns. The way our understanding of nature mimics these organic patterns in the natural world, and that repeat independently of scale. This could be representations, from outer space or on the submolecular level. So you hear it's kind of, the phrase "survival of the fittest" is very common, and it's misleading if you understand it in these terms listed on the left. Survival of the fittest is misleading if you think of fitness in terms of any quality independent of the specific context in which it's exercised. So we can think of like we can measure fitness in a supposedly objective way in terms of strength. We do that with ourselves. It's how we might measure our fitness. Um, but that's not what fitness means in Darwinism, um, because it doesn't matter. What matters is being able to survive in particular circumstances, and whatever allows you to do that is what makes you fit. So I think of it more in terms of fittedness. You fit into a species survives because it fits into a ecological network. Um, and I really want to emphasize this is a functional definition of fitness. What allows a species to survive cannot be causally explained. Um, all we know is that it didn't fail. But what allows it to persist exactly can't be reduced to determinate cause like strength or generalizable um, quality. It's context specific. It's always embedded within the particular web and provisional. It's something that succeeds provisionally. It's all we can know is that it's succeeding now, not that it's going to prevail forever. Um, so that to to me suggests there's something deeply queer about Darwin's conception of fitness, the survival of the fittest, the struggle for existence, um, and which and by queer I just mean to emphasize this idea of radical diversity, of ever stranger, unpredictable variations, modifications. A static system that just stays the same, fails to diversify. That's a sign of an unsuccessful, vulnerable, or dying form of life. Just like Darwin describes the natural world in terms of a polity, it's a kind of city populated with all the diverse species. He likewise refers to the geological record as a book or um, relics of lost ancient languages. And he talks a lot about, breeding of domesticated animals. So I want to point out how much he relies on human cultural for metaphors of evolution. I think that's helpful, like for thinking about Eliot. Like Darwin, she's interested in evoking this deep web of complex patterns in the world. So, by way of suggesting the boundless, sublime scale of time entailed by evolution, Darwin suggests that we look at the fossil record as terribly fragmentary, minimal trace of this vast history, that it's arrogant to expect a complete picture of such a vast history, that we have to rely, like we do in thinking about climate change, on our imagination to evoke scales of time that we just can't think directly. Hence, I think that there's a role for aesthetics. Finally, be able to identify species, Darwin suggests. It's almost like you have to become interactive with them. You have to know them so well. So that's to say, recognition almost becomes like a family relationship. That's what aesthetic experience is, right? It's a experience of feeling at home Not one man in 1,000 has accuracy of eye and judgment sufficient to become an eminent breeder. If gifted with these qualities and he studies his subject for years and devotes his lifetime to it with indomitable perseverance, he will succeed and make many great improvements. If he wants any of these qualities, he will assuredly fail. That men follow it as a trade. The sheep are placed on a table and studied like a picture by a connoisseur. Species, the animal, nature in general teaches you how to read it. To the extent that you impose your perspective on it, you get it wrong. You need to learn in an interactive way how to see it on its own terms. And a lot of seeing the world on its own terms, seeing nature on its own terms, means recognizing possibilities of life that we couldn't conceive before. Sort of like the poem We Are Seven, noticing what we thought didn't count as life, being surprised and open to recognize new forms of life. I think that's part of what Darwin's suggesting when he talks about the imperfection of the geological record. Being where we see nothing but dirt or absence or a lack of life, he wants us to imagine what's missing. Darwin asks us to think about what's absent from the geological record, but he also asks us to think about what's absent from the living ecology today. What just seems like waste, dead, inert context, background of life. So he looks at plants that have been considered ill-adapted for wide dissemination and found their seeds are well adapted to travel over the sea. He found 87 kinds of seeds, 64 germinated after an immersion of 28 days, and a few survived an immersion of 137 days. Stones embedded in tree roots store seeds, how birds carry seeds through their digestive system, and how predatory birds spread the seeds eaten by other birds, and icebergs and rocks, erratic boulders, fragments of granite, and wind. These means of transport are sometimes called accidental, but this is not strictly correct. The currents of the sea are not accidental, nor is the direction of the prevalent gales of wind. So he's finding life, means of reproduction, ecological patterns in what otherwise seem dead, inert matter, waste or refuse of life. So in poems like Blake's Sunflower or Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, it can seem fantastical to project human-like desire onto nature, even the material world. But, even trying to think about death, where the traveler's journey is done, the hereafter, the sheer act of communication. This is sort of about the creation of cultural value as another level, remediating energy, redirecting value. So even thinking of where the journey's done, where life is over, it can help reanimating it with desire, aspiration, arising, wishing, just like Coleridge's Ministry of Frost becomes a mirror of thought, of the movement of his own thinking. Another example of such a symbol is also a mathematical theory, very sophisticated theory of chaos called the butterfly effect.
Chaos really came into focus in the 1960s when meteorologist Ed Lorenz tried to make a basic computer simulation of the Earth's atmosphere. He had 12 equations and 12 variables, things like temperature, pressure, humidity, and so on. And the computer would print out each time step as a row of 12 numbers, so you could watch how they evolved over time. Now, the breakthrough came when Lorenz wanted to redo a run, but as a shortcut, he entered the numbers from halfway through a previous printout, and then he set the computer calculating. He went off to get some coffee, and when he came back and saw the results, Lorenz was stunned. The new run followed the old one for a short while, but then it diverged. And pretty soon it was describing a totally different state of the atmosphere. I mean, totally different weather. Lorenz's first thought, of course, was that the computer had broken. Maybe a vacuum tube had blown, but none had. The real reason for the difference came down to the fact the printer rounded to 3 decimal places, whereas the computer calculated with 6. So when he entered those initial conditions, the difference of less than 1 part in 1,000 created totally different weather just a short time into the future. Now, Lorenz tried simplifying his equations and then simplifying them some more down to just 3 equations and 3 variables, which represented a toy model of convection, essentially a 2D slice of the atmosphere, heated at the bottom and cooled at the top. But again, he got the same type of behavior. If he changed the numbers just a tiny bit, the results diverged dramatically. Lorenz's system displayed what's become known as sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which is the hallmark of chaos. Now, since Lorenz was working with 3 variables, we can plot the phase space of his system in 3 dimensions. We can pick any point as our initial state and watch how it evolves. Does our point move toward a fixed attractor or a repeating loop? It doesn't seem to. In truth, our system will never revisit the same exact state again. Here, I actually started with 3 closely spaced initial states, and they've been evolving together so far, but now they're starting to diverge. From being arbitrarily close together, they end up on totally different trajectories. This is sensitive dependence on initial conditions in action. Now, I should point out that there is nothing random at all about this system of equations. It's completely deterministic, just like the pendulum. So if you could input exactly the same initial conditions, you would get exactly the same result. The problem is, unlike the pendulum, this system is chaotic. So any difference in initial conditions, no matter how tiny, will be amplified to a totally different final state. It seems like a paradox, but this system is both deterministic and unpredictable. Because in practice, you could never know the initial conditions with perfect accuracy, and I'm talking infinite decimal places. But the result suggests why even today with huge supercomputers, it's so hard to forecast the weather more than a week in advance. In fact, studies have shown that by the 8th day of a long-range forecast, the prediction is less accurate than if you just took the historical average conditions for that day. And knowing about chaos, meteorologists no longer make just a single forecast. Instead, they make ensemble forecasts, varying initial conditions and model parameters to create a set of predictions. Now, far from being the exception to the rule, chaotic systems have been turning up everywhere. The double pendulum, just 2 simple pendulums connected together, is chaotic. Here, 2 double pendulums have been released simultaneously with almost the same initial conditions. But no matter how hard you try, you could never release a double pendulum and make it behave the same way twice. Its motion will forever be unpredictable. You might think that chaos always requires a lot of energy or irregular motions, but this system of 5 fidget spinners with repelling magnets in each of their arms is chaotic too. At first glance, the system seems to repeat regularly, but if you watch more closely, you'll notice some strange motions. A spinner suddenly flips the other way. Even our solar system is not predictable. A study simulating our solar system for 100 million years into the future found its behavior as a whole to be chaotic, with a characteristic time of about 4 million years. That means within, say, 10 or 15 million years, some planets or moons may have collided or been flung out of the solar system entirely. The very system we think of as the model of order is unpredictable on even modest timescales. But there is a silver lining. Let's look again at the phase space of Lorenz's equations. If we start with a whole bunch of different initial conditions and watch them evolve, initially the motion is messy. But soon all the points have moved towards or onto an object. The object, coincidentally, looks a bit like a butterfly. It is the attractor. For a large range of initial conditions, the system evolves into a state on this attractor. Now remember, all the paths traced out here never cross, and they never connect to form a loop. If they did, then they would continue on that loop forever, and the behavior would be periodic and predictable. So each path here is actually an infinite curve in a finite space. But how is that possible? Fractals, but that's a story for another video. This particular attractor is called the Lorentz attractor, probably the most famous example of a chaotic attractor, though many others have been found for other systems of equations. Now, if people have heard anything about the butterfly effect, it's usually about how tiny causes make the future unpredictable. But the science behind the butterfly effect also reveals a deep and beautiful structure underlying the dynamics, one that can provide useful insights into the behavior of a system. So you can't predict how any individual state will evolve, but you can say how a collection of states evolves. And at least in the case of Lorentz's equations, they take the shape of a butterfly.
Eliot begins chapter 27 of Middlemarch with this famous parable about a mirror with covered in little scratches that go every which way. But if you hold a candle up to it, it appears as if the scratches are centered around the candle. So it's sort of another image of this, like finding patterns among random events. That's what Darwin's tree is. Frost crystals, any of these fractal or arboreal forms of environmental interaction. They're mapping random variation within particular ecologies, always changing, always provisional, always responsive to new circumstances. It's another way in which I think Darwin's theory insists on a rich recognition of strangeness or queerness, insisting on the vital role of all that history forgets. All of these overproduced life forms are testing for environmental niches to exploit, possibilities of diversification. It's a common process. Only a few survive, but they survive by virtue of this common procedure of overpopulation. Sort of like history is told by the winners. You tend to look on the past as if the story is about why you needed to succeed, but the losers were integral to the story too. You couldn't be here without them. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche has a great passage about this in his book The Gay Science, about basically how any linear story we tell ourselves about history, reducing the historical process to these, discrete causal chains, leave out the vast majority of experience, all that experience that happens while you're making other plans. All that neglected, forgotten, the losers of history. So just bearing witness to this, sort of like a butterfly effect. It's about recognizing a kind of patterning of life, where the squirrel's heartbeat, the roar on the other side of silence, that Nietzsche here evokes as the reflection of the sun in the oars of the poorest fisherman. Meagerest form of life, persisting, is reduced to this most basic rhythm. And Nietzsche wonderfully suggests that this makes even the sun itself richer, to be reflected in this meagerest way. So again, this economy of abundance would seem the most valuable. The sun, source of all value, is actually enriched by its reflection in this most meager rhythm of persistent life. He who knows how to regard the history of man in its entirety as his own history feels in the immense generalization all the grief of the invalid who thinks of health, of the old man who thinks of the dream of his youth, of the lover who is robbed of his beloved, of the martyr whose ideal is destroyed, of the hero on the evening of an indecisive battle which has brought him wounds and the loss of a friend. but to bear this immense sum of grief of all kinds, to be able to bear it and yet still be the hero who, at the commencement of a second day of battle, greets the dawn in his happiness. It's that persistent abundance. The story is never over. To take all this upon his soul, the oldest, the newest, the losses, hopes, conquests, and victories of mankind, to have all this at last in one soul, and to comprise it in one feeling, this would necessarily furnish a happiness which man has not hitherto known, a God's happiness, full of power and love, full of tears and laughter, a happiness which, like the sun in the evening, continually gives of its inexhaustible riches and empties into the sea. And, like the sun, too, feels itself richest when even the poorest fisherman rows with golden oars. This divine feeling might then be called humanity. So, again, that basic principle of abundance, that what's mysterious, what defies our understanding, is not a lack, but a gift. As Thomas de Quincey says, is whenever you don't understand something, that's the thing that counts the most, that you should be most interested in exploring and curious about. And I think that's Darwin's perspective as well, that what we don't understand always has a vital, crucial role in why we're here, and why we've succeeded in the struggle to exist. Maybe the most crucial role. That's what these romantic poems are exploring in terms of sort of viral communication. The ancient mariner needs to tell his tale. He doesn't know why. We don't know why we're reading it exactly. It gets we just get held compulsively by his voice, like the wedding guest. And that's a different kind of reproduction. It's juxtaposed to the wedding. It interrupts the wedding. This transmission of awareness of the strangeness, both of our own violence, killing the albatross arbitrarily, but also bearing witness to the beauty and complexity of the world, the way the mariner does when the albatross falls from his neck. These are strange kinds of emotional awareness, environmental awareness, transmitted, I think, virally, emotional contagion, imaginative contagion, awareness of these patterns in our own reproduction. But especially what we reproduce when we reproduce is out of our control, much stranger than we could know. The genetic trees that we're propagating. Think of ourselves as handing down to the next generation, as Blake reminds us, this distinction between good and bad love, like health and disease, the plant and the weed, is often arbitrary. One way to look at what we're experiencing now with the coronavirus is that it's revealing to us ways in which we're interdependent that we had not been noticing, acknowledging, taking responsibility for. And, viruses as old as life itself co-evolved with organic life forms. Viruses themselves are inorganic, like, ice crystals, but they're parasitic on live organisms and have been responsible for a lot of our evolutionary adaptation. Mutations have been transmitted by way of viruses. Philip Larkin's amazing This Be the Verse talks about this kind of perfectly in terms of the way in which each generation fucks up the next. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. The verse itself is kind of fucking you over. it's infecting you with what fucked it up. I think that's a perfect image. The coastal shelf, it's like geological record, infinite, unimaginable past that led to us is largely and deeply fucked up, full of unthinkable violence. But it's a verse. Like I've been saying, it communicates a musical form or rhythm. Verse means to turn. And so I like the way in which the verse itself, the music itself of the language, turns around the meaning of the narrative of the poem. It mobilizes a different form of reproduction, communication, that is this knowledge of the fucked up, the sick love, the sick rose, the disease, but in the form of verse. The verse itself offers a variation on the story of generations fucking each other over, a new mutation, a new modification. That's the promise of culture. Again, accommodate our abundance, accommodate each other. That's what language offers, like Frankenstein, a way of recognizing each other without rivalry. I mean, language is the ultimate ecological adaptation. We can represent and reimagine each other without exploiting any resources. I think that's perhaps the most crucial adaptation of people as a species is singing. Community coordination through song.